Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on IGTV and on Facebook. So today's episode we're really excited about. This is one of the topics that when we first started talking about doing Real Talk, we really wanted to make this episode happen. So I know we're both really excited to kind of get into this one. And the topic is how to support a dating partner who has disclosed that they've experienced some type of trauma. So whether that's sexual assault or abuse in some form, and just how to support them when they're disclosing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about kind of throughout your relationship after you've kind of received that disclosure. So we thought it would be interesting to kind of start with the don'ts on supporting, things not to do, and then go into the ways that you can support. Yeah. So do you want to start, Sydney, with one idea that you have, but don't?
Oh gosh, you're putting
me on the spot. Go for it.
So I think like the first thing that pops into my head is like, don't tell them they're lying. Like, I mean, like, oh my God, that's not true. There's no way that that's what happened. Kind of a reaction, like, it's a very blatant answer, but that's the first one that I think of, I think.
Yeah, that's huge. That's a good one right off the bat. Ooh, okay.
Like, let's jump right into it. That's what it is. Don't do that.
Don't assume what they need, I think, is another big one. Like, I think some people, especially if this is someone that you love or care about, maybe you don't love, maybe you just like, I don't know. But if they're disclosing something really heavy, sometimes our initial reaction, if we haven't maybe experienced trauma, we think like, oh, I'm going to hug them because they look sad or, whatever. But especially with people who've been through trauma, like, don't assume that a hug is what they need, or don't assume anything. Maybe they do want a hug, but just ask what they need, I think, is a good way to go about it. So don't assume things that they need in that time of support.
That's a good one. And I know we keep using the word disclosure, like for people who maybe aren't as like familiar, like when your partner or just somebody that you're dating shares with you that they have this experience or had this kind of experience, it could be in a really casual setting. It could be over a text. It could be like, hey, I want to talk to you about something really serious. Like it'll look really different for every person, but that is what we mean by disclosure. Like when somebody shares this with you, maybe for the first time,
right?
What's the best way to kind of respond. The next thing that I was thinking too is don't push for more details. Like they are going to give you what feels comfortable, and hopefully maybe will give you more, but it's not necessary for you to know all of the details to be able to support them.
Yeah, that's huge because you don't want to re-traumatize them by having them relive it. So they may want to share just little bits and pieces for a certain reason. Like maybe they're only disclosing in that moment because they feel like they need to for safety reason or whatever it might be. So yeah, that's a good one. My other thought, I was thinking that one actually, and I was like, darn. But my next one was going to be don't push them to report it or like do anything about it. Like don't, even if it feels like it's coming from a place of care, right? Of like, I want you to get help, so I want you to report this. It's so not up to you, right? Like it's completely up to them, what's best for them. Let them decide what they're going to do with their own story, with their own experience. So don't push them to report it, whether that's, to the police or go to the hospital or, report it to their university or school.
Or whatever. Get counseling or what, like don't push them to do anything.
Right. Yeah. Anything at all, really. It's kind of the opposite of support.
Right. And I think that idea of I always try to focus on like how can we restore someone's power, make them feel more in control because it was taken away from them. So like this is what we have to do and this is what you have to do next is the opposite of that. So like we want to avoid those things. I think the other thing that I was thinking, and of course now it's left my brain, is to not get upset that they didn't tell you sooner.
Yeah.
Always hear that response, whether it's like something bad has happened, like trauma, or like you just had a fight with someone or whatever. People are like, oh my God, why didn't you tell me this sooner? Like, let's not make the person feel guilty. Like it's hard enough to kind of come forward and disclose.
Yeah, that's a good one. I was thinking too, like, don't make it about you is
Mhm.
another one, I feel like. And I know sometimes, like, maybe it makes sense, or maybe it's appropriate at times to connect it back to maybe you've experienced a similar trauma, and that can make them feel less alone by sharing. But I think it's important to, like, read their body language and read kind of the room of, like, how they're feeling. And there's a right time and kind of a wrong time to, like, center it back to yourself and your own experiences. And I think particularly when they're first disclosing, maybe it's really important to kind of focus, really listen to them, and, like, focus on what they're saying, and not turn it back onto, like, oh my gosh, I totally know what you mean. Like, one time and then bring up something else. Because it just may not be helpful, and, like, also takes away from, like, the gravity of kind of the situation, because
Exactly.
sharing is really scary. So if they're feeling like, I don't know, the wind's kind of taken out of their sails a bit, that may not create more space for them to want to share more. So.
Exactly. Even if that was your intention, was of like, I'm going to show you that like we can connect here, and like I've been through this before, or even if someone is saying like, oh, I've had to support someone in the past with this before, like you were just saying, taking the wind out of their sails, of like they finally found this chance to use their voice, and then it gets silenced, even if the
Right.
intention was good, like that won't feel comfortable. And I think that another thing is, and we didn't really touch base about this beforehand, and I'm laughing because it's a larger conversation than I think just like, let's rattle off the do's and don'ts.
I trust you.
But when someone discloses that they maybe were assaulted within the time of the relationship, like within the
Mm,
time frame, right? So telling your partner that maybe you've been with for years, or 5 minutes or a month, who cares, that you were assaulted last night or last week or something,
yeah.
definitely brings its own host of dynamics and difficulties and fears and everything else that's very different than saying, oh, 5 years before we met, or this thing happened to me.
Right.
um, and all the same things that we've kind of been saying so far would still apply, but there is this weird thing, and I've seen it happen, and it makes me feel frustrated for the person who experienced the assault, that someone would center themselves on that kind of experience.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, that's a good one. I had another one, and then it also just like right out of my head. I mean, I
Like,
was thinking along the lines of, like, don't judge, right? Obviously. Um, and that's kind of a really big statement that covers a lot of things, right? Like, don't judge what they were doing when it happened. Don't judge, like, you know, how they're feeling. Don't judge how they're reacting. Don't even judge how they're speaking about it. Maybe the words and the language that they're using seems kind of like awkward or odd to you, but to them, those are the only words they can kind of grasp around what happened. So just trying to refrain from judgment in any sense, I think is important. That wasn't the one I was going to say, but it fell out of my head. So
but it's important nonetheless. It definitely is important. And I think what you were just saying about like not judging the words that they're using, it's also important to not label their experience for them, right? Like,
yes.
not being like, oh my gosh, that was rape, or oh my gosh, that's
Yeah.
emotional abuse. Like, using those words lightly, because even if somebody is understanding that they've been through something enough that they want to take the time to disclose it, they might not be ready for those words or labels, and it's nobody else's position but theirs to kind of find the space to use them.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably where I was going to go with that. My other thought that fell out of my head. But yeah, that's so huge. I feel like we do that a lot as advocates and counselors too, is like
Yeah.
mirroring their language, but also like mirroring their mood and their vibe kind of thing. Like, if, they're, I don't know, some people like to deflect with humor, and that might feel like odd to some people, but like try to match that and kind of like gauge where they're at.
Right.
Some people like have nervous laughter, and that's how they get through things. So not minimizing it, right, if they're, laughing through it or whatever, but really kind of meeting them where they're at, with their language and whatever kind of vibe they're giving off too.
Yeah, definitely. I like that you said not minimizing it because of how they bring it to you, because even if the conversation lasts 2 minutes, like, it's so much more for the survivor or, you know, the victim or however they choose to identify. And like, they've let you in on that part of their world. So it's not little to them. And that's why they've brought it up. And whether it takes up a ton of space or a little bit of space for them, like, you now know like some really important information, and it's important to not minimize it in like future experiences or kind of judge or compare them to other people that maybe have told you this stuff about them before.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of made me think of another don't, but the other don't that I was thinking of made me think of a do. So do you have any other don'ts, or do we want to shift into do's?
I don't, right, like I'm sure if
I don't.
I'm fine, but
I don't have don'ts.
I don't have don'ts, no more. And I know we just like listed off a bunch of things, and this is not something that we expect people to be like taking notes on and whatever.
But you totally can.
Yeah, definitely can. And, you know, as always, we're going to ask you for your feedback eventually, but like, just an FYI, like, you don't need a list, like, but these are thoughts.
And this is definitely not an exhaustive list either. Like, obviously, we're just kind of thinking of things off the top of our heads that we find, you know, helpful or think could be helpful, but there may be other things. And that's especially why we like, you know, would love to hear from the audience too, if they have other things that have worked for them in their relationships. So, okay, cool. So shifting into the do's. So the one that I was thinking about now, of course, my brain is like, no.
Wait.
But it was going off of what you were saying about like not labeling it for them. And just, I can't think of it. It totally fell out of my head. So I'll start with a different one. Do make space kind of for this information. Oh, that's what it was. Brain. Yes.
Ta-da!
Brought it back. The don't that I was thinking of is like, don't make them now your go-to person on like learning about abuse and assault and like, you know, whatever it was. Maybe if you don't have that knowledge, like, don't use them as like a information source or whatever. Like, and that's why I was thinking of the do is do your own research, like do your own homework on you know, looking up, there's tons of resources out there. Obviously, that's why we wanted to make this video, because this can be a resource for you, the partner that's supporting the partner. But there's tons of resources online through other like national organizations on how to support someone. You can always call a hotline like ours to say, you know, like my partner just disclosed this to me and I don't know what to do to support them. Can you give me tips?
Right.
So don't put the responsibility back on the partner to like tell you exactly what to do. Obviously you want to ask them what they need because that's going to be specific to them, but do your research, do your homework, and kind of understand trauma, even in the basic sense of like what trauma can look like.
Yeah. I like that. That was so important and so powerful, because that would be another way, right, I guess, of centering the experience on yourself in the position of receiving the disclosure. And like, that's different than saying, thank you for telling me, how can I support you, kind of thing. And that maybe brings me to my first do, right, is honoring the fact that they chose to share this information with you, and like thanking them for it, because it's not an easy thing for people to disclose for a million and one reasons, no matter how much you know that they believe that you support them and love them or like them or whatever it might be. And I think, you know, just thank you so much for telling me this or sharing that with me is like a good like first step, because I think it's natural to like fumble and not know how to respond when someone says this to you, and you're probably going to be safe with that, of like just a thank you at first and then finding your words.
Yeah, 100%. If that's the only thing that comes out of your mouth in that moment, like let it be that, you know, of acknowledging how difficult it was for them to open up. And I think that leads me to the other do of do be patient. That sounds weird, but be patient, be understanding with kind of what they're disclosing, how they're disclosing, when they're disclosing. We kind of talked about this before about this episode of like, you may only receive a small piece of the story. And that's all you'll ever receive. And kind of like you were talking about before of like, don't try to get that information, but also like, don't take it personally. If, they don't want to share more, it doesn't have to do with you usually, hopefully. If it does, that's maybe a bigger issue in the relationship. But yeah, it's not personal, right? Like they're dealing with their own stuff and it might be something very new to them. So just being patient and understanding of how difficult it is to open up.
Yeah.
And maybe helping if they want that support elsewhere, like helping them connect to other resources. So like that's another good do is like, don't push them to do what we were talking about before of like reporting or whatever, but you can encourage them to find support elsewhere, whether that's coming to counseling, calling the hotline, like with us, or going to one of our support groups, or tons of other resources that are available. So you can encourage that or just remind them that they have those options without pushing them to do something.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a way to have that conversation of like, hey, I know about this resource, I know about the Women's Center on my campus, like I wonder if there's something at yours, or like also maybe you go to WCSU and like you could access the Women's Center or something like that. But while you were talking, I was reminded of a don't.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ask them what they were wearing. Don't ask them if they were drinking. Don't ask them where they were and why they were by themselves, because it just doesn't matter.
Literally doesn't matter.
It just really doesn't. And that is, again, not likely to make them feel supported or comfortable or like they want to continue opening up like they were already trying to do. But yeah, I didn't say that earlier. But you were mentioning before, like, do make space for this conversation. And I don't think that we really dove into it as much as we could have. So I wonder if you wanted to talk like a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of things I guess we can go in with that. But like, I guess my thought initially was not being afraid of the subject. Like, it's hard enough for them to have gone through it, let alone then talk about it. So I think a kind of don't and do, they mix, is like, don't be so scared that you're like, I'm going to say the wrong thing, so I can't say anything. And like, oh, I'm not the best person to talk to about this. Like, talk to a professional, like, and kind of closing off because you're afraid of, I mean, we get it. We were saying, I just love that before this episode, Sydney and I were talking for our audience, and Sydney was like, yeah, I mean, I forget that these are not normal conversations for people. Like, we talk about this stuff all the time, but these are not conversations that people typically have. So we get that. So if you're, afraid of the topic because it's not in your vocabulary to normally talk about trauma or abuse or assault or whatever, that's okay. But just don't be so afraid of it that you then close yourself off as a support person for your partner. You don't have to say all of the right things. There are obviously wrong things to say, like we kind of went over, of like blaming, judging, whatever. But as long as you can be empathetic, and this is kind of our rule of thumb as like advocates, is as long as you can create a non-judgmental space that is open and you're empathetic to that person, that's like the best kind of rule of thumb to support someone. So that's kind of where my thoughts were.
That makes so much sense. And I think like I'm realizing like we started talking about like how to support a dating partner when they disclose, but the conversation we've had up to this moment in time really is like how to support anyone that discloses to you.
Very true.
So I just want to honor that. Like if you're watching this and then you're like, oh, well, my friend told me, so nothing that Cara and Sydney said is going to like equate. It's not true.
Yeah.
But I think like specifically in a dating relationship, right, in terms of like making space for the conversation, someone who has experienced assault or abuse or whatever it was in any type of way might, approach the conversation of like, hey, I have something really important I want to share with you and I want to talk to you about it. That's going to be like indicative of like this person wants to have a conversation, or like at least have me as their partner make some space to hear their story or hear maybe the why they want to tell me. Why is it important for me to know like what's shifting, what's going on in the environment or like in the relationship. Maybe there's a weird like date coming up or something's really hard that's happening, and there's a really real reason that somebody has been like implored to tell their partner at that time. Other people might, hey, this weird thing happened to me when I was younger. Like, oh yeah, that happened to me, while you're watching TV, and like they just kind of drop it and like leave it. It's important to like follow the person's lead that's making the disclosure.
Yes.
And that's where it went for me when you said like, do make space for it. Because if you respond to the like, oh, I want to talk to you about something really important that's happened to me, and that like kind of like has adjusted the way I move about the world or whatever that is, and you're just like, oh, okay, and like move on, like that's not going to feel great for this person who kind of probably amped themselves up to like share a lot with you.
Yeah.
Now you've done the opposite of make space for them. And it's really easy to make space by just being empathetic and like, thank you for telling me, and I'm here for you, and how can I help you, and what do you need from me right now? How can I be supportive?
Yeah.
Are all ways to make space.
Yeah. And that made me think of another kind of do is, and this one can vary depending on your partner, or friend or family member. Again, you're right. This can really apply to anyone. And I think there's a couple other like dating specific ones that we can talk about, of like being intimate with your partner after knowing, that they've kind of disclosed these things, and that's kind of specific to a relationship. But I think another thing that I find important is do check in with them. They may not want to talk, like maybe they disclosed one day and then you talked it out, and then they don't bring it up again for a few weeks or a few months or whatever it may be. Obviously you want to let them lead that conversation and everything too, but also like don't be afraid to bring it up at least once to see how they feel. Like maybe you bring it up after a few weeks and they're like, please don't bring it up again unless I do. That's fair, right? Like that's if they communicate that, or maybe you want to ask them that of like, is it okay if I check in with you about this? If something comes up, or if I'm noticing that you seem off or whatever. Communication is key in any relationship, but I think that's important that like it's scary enough to bring it up once, but then if they're maybe feeling triggered one day, or something hit them really hard, or like something made them think of that, what happened to them, or was reminding them of that, or they were watching a movie and something was like something, if something comes up and they're feeling it, but they're like, oh, I don't want to burden, which we'll have another episode about that, of like, you're not burdening your partner, you're not burdening anyone. You can make the space for yourself. Yes, spoiler. But they might feel scared to bring it up again. So it might be helpful as the partner to bring it up with them initially. And then if you get the sense that they're like, I really don't want to talk about this anymore, just follow their lead. But you don't have to wait for them to constantly be the one to bring it up too.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. And I'm glad that you said the thing about the movie, because sometimes someone might feel triggered by a lot of different things. And maybe this is how we kind of talk about like when it shows up later on in the relationship, like after a disclosure's been made. And like survivors are triggered in a lot of different ways, whether it's by like being back in their familiar environment, or like hearing sexual violence being talked about on a TV show or a movie. And like if that's something that you're watching with your partner after they've made a disclosure, and you notice them like just like being a little funny or funny, or whatever, and like you notice like body language, like it's okay to offer support, it's okay to check in, unless they're like no, right? Like your intentions are probably going to be good in that, like maybe you want to sit a little closer to that person or something, if that's something that is okay with them, because it's hard for a survivor to watch something on TV about sexual assault, or see something in the news, or whatever that might be. So as a supportive, caring partner, you're not going to be wrong when like a little like red flag pops up for you of like, oh, maybe I should check in, and like finding the way to do that based on your way of relating and communicating with your partner within your relationship isn't a bad idea.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important. I know talking about triggers, like I know that was a word that was used very lightly, and in like social culture, whatever, of like making fun of getting triggered, which I think is just so frustrating, because it's real. I mean, we maybe we can have another episode about this. We'll talk about that later, but PTSD is real. People who have experienced either domestic violence, who've witnessed domestic violence, were victim of child abuse, or they've experienced a sexual assault. It's not kind of something that only happens. I think people think of PTSD with like people in the military and things like that, which absolutely is valid and real, but it's also very much real for survivors of trauma as it relates to interpersonal violence. And so PTSD can show up in a lot of different ways. So kind of going back to what I was saying before of like informing yourself and educating yourself, that's a huge piece, but also educating yourself with your partner on what they need when they are triggered. They may not even know yet. It depends on where they're at kind of in their healing. They may be very new because maybe the experience was very recent and they're still figuring out what they need. Maybe that's something you can work on together. Or maybe it happened, a long time ago and they've been in counseling and they know when I'm triggered, I don't want to be touched. Yeah. I don't want to talk about it, or like I need a hug or I need to cry or whatever it is. So do your own research to understand PTSD and triggers and things like that, if that's something that they have or have experienced. And communicate with that. I feel like it just comes down to communication really, and like empathy of just getting, not assuming what they need, but also like respecting all the different things, because people respond to trauma so differently. So you might think like, oh, when they're triggered, they're going to be crying and they're going to be whatever, but maybe they'll be laughing. Maybe they'll like, who knows?
Down or whatever it'll be.
Yeah.
And I think too, like trying not to take the triggers personally.
Yes.
Right? Of like, if somebody,
unless you've done something wrong, like, and that's another piece to like take accountability. If you have like maybe crossed a boundary and didn't mean to not like get upset about it, just to take it as it is and own it and be like, okay, I'm going to learn from this and not do it again. But yes.
And like not do it again. Yeah. Right. No, I'm glad that you said that, because that's true. Like sometimes people are jerks and will like focus on
or like, we don't know boundaries and they're crossed, like you're figuring it out, and that's fair, but as long as it's not intentional.
Like you mentioned in the beginning too, like not everybody has these conversations every day all the time. So like the topic alone can feel awkward for people and they don't really know how to dance around it, and maybe, or not how to not dance around it. Maybe it's and like maybe this survivor is okay with making a joke about something because that's how they're going to get like through that difficult moment or uncomfortable moment where it came up in class and like people are talking about sexual violence or whatever it might be, and like they have to just joke to like get through it. Follow their lead, right? Like maybe that's not the thing we want to joke about. And what the heck was I gonna say? Oh, what was I saying?
I thought of another don't, if you want to think about what you were gonna say.
Oh, I got it, but go ahead.
Okay, go for it. No, go for it. I'll go after.
Well, about not taking triggers personally. So you had brought up earlier, like when you're like being intimate with your partner and maybe they're triggered during like any type of physical intimacy, and maybe they need to step up or step back and get away and like go like take a moment to like collect themselves. Like if you've not done something intentionally wrong or what, you know what I mean? Like it's really, really valid for somebody who has experienced abuse or assault in any kind of way to feel very triggered when engaging in sexual activity again, even if they feel completely safe and you've checked in and you are both willing and ready and excited to like do this or whatever. Like it is still very possible that somebody might be like, whoa, no, and like just kind of be triggered immediately, and that responding in a way that is supportive and loving and caring and kind of like, what can I do? Maybe what did I do? How can I help you? How can I be there for you? Versus like getting angry that they've like stopped or that they got up and got away, right? Like trying not to get offended that means something about you. Like maybe it is just their trauma showing up.
Yeah, that's so big. And I feel like that's true for even if someone has, maybe they're, they've put in a lot of work, with a therapist or a counselor or whatever, and they may get frustrated with themselves because maybe they have had multiple great encounters with you as the dating partner for months or years you've been together, and all of a sudden a smell or a sight, like anything can trigger that person, a position, you know, their body position, whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
So like really being patient. I know I said that before, but being patient with that. Even if someone has like, you know, they feel like, you know, I'm healing and I'm really in a good place right now. Healing isn't linear. So sometimes it can feel like you've taken 100 steps forward and then a huge step back, which can feel that way, but obviously, you know, is valid. So yeah, being patient with wherever they're at and, you know, again, not taking personally, like you said. The other don't/do that I was thinking of is don't disclose their experience to anyone else after they've shared it with you, unless they've given you like explicit permission, you know, to be able to talk about it with someone else. So like, if you do feel like you are holding onto this huge thing, holding space for it, and you don't want to burden your partner now by being like, that was a lot for me to process. I think that's a nice way to maybe end this part of the conversation too, of like, it's a lot. Like, we're not trying to dismiss the fact that it's easy to receive a disclosure if you, you know, are receiving it for the first time by this person or ever. Like, it can be really heavy. It can be intense. If you've experienced trauma, it can bring stuff up for you too. So like, please do take care of yourself, like when you're receiving that disclosure and afterwards. So if you need support, instead of calling like your best friend as you normally would for things that you might need support with, it's not your place to share that information with anyone without your partner's permission. So if you want, you can call us, right? Like, that's what we're here for. We're confidential. So if you need support after receiving a disclosure, a confidential person would be the best person to go to, rather than like your friend or your mom or your dad or whoever, because we never, I mean, that's why we're confidential. We never want to breach that person's privacy. Not just because it's policy, but because it's like, you know, you were saying in the very beginning, like, this might be the hardest thing they've ever done, you know, disclosing this. So we want to really honor that and not disrespect, you know, that courage that it took to share with you, and then just, you know, share it with other people. So yeah.
Exactly. While at the same time honoring the fact that it is hard to hear it, and you are 100% valid in maybe needing some support and like debriefing it, and there's resources available for it. Because like you said, if you call your best friend and talk to them about it, there's a great chance that your partner will interact with your best friend at one point, and now someone else knows their story, and like, it's just not fair, even if it was out of the most wonderful intentioned place, to like not have to talk about it with them and like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. Like, there's nothing wrong with calling us and reaching out and saying, hey, like, I learned some news and I don't know what to do. And whether it's one-time conversation or we meet a couple times and we talk about it and then figure out like, how do I support them? What do I do? How do I help them? Like, that's exactly what we're here for. So I think that this conversation was so great, and I feel like we have a lot more that we could say.
I know, we could talk about this for hours.
Forever.
Maybe we'll do a part 2 another time.
Yeah, really. I really want to like ask people for their feedback. Like, let us know, like, what have you seen show up in your relationships that's been helpful? We're going to post this all online, so you can answer us in comments. You can direct message us. You can email us confidentially, right? Like, you can send us emails. People won't read your comments if that's uncomfortable for you, but reach out. So you can reach out to us via email or phone, and my email is sydney.t@wcogd.org or treza.s@wcsu.edu, and Cara's is cara.m @wcogd.org or macklerc@wcsu.edu, and our office phone number is 203-837-3939. And I also want to share today that our confidential hotline is 203-731-5204. So if you feel like you need some debriefing after watching this episode, we know we release them at 5:00, so like we're at closed. Our confidential hotline is 24 hours. Someone will be there to support you. Really reach out if you need to. Again, the number is 203-731-5204. Remember, these episodes are all recorded and will be available to view on IGTV, YouTube, and Facebook. You can find us on Instagram at WCOGD_on campus and Facebook at the Women's Center on campus, where the YouTube link will also be available. Please share this with your friends and stay tuned for next week's episode. And thank you so much for joining us and to listening what we have to say every week.
Yeah, we are so excited. I'm glad we had this conversation. We were really excited about this episode.
Yeah, definitely.
We hope you all enjoyed it too, and
Thanks, everyone.
see you next week.